Distinguished panelists, members of the Walter Roberts Endowment Advisory Board, friends and colleagues, good evening and welcome to the 10th Annual Walter R. Roberts Lecture. I'm Janet Steele, the Director of the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. And tonight, IPDGC and the Walter Roberts Endowment are very excited to present a panel discussion focusing on the topic of what should the United States do to promote global media freedom. Our panelists are, as you know, quite an outstanding group. We have former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, Richard Stengel, former Voice of America Director Amanda Bennett, and USC Professor Nicholas Cull, the author of numerous works on public diplomacy and the history of the US Information Agency. It's especially fitting that our program tonight focuses on the threat to global media freedom. Throughout his 42-year career, Dr. Roberts was dedicated to the advancement of public diplomacy through the creation of Voice of America in 1942, diplomatic assignments in Europe, presidential appointments to the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, and 10 years of teaching at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Dr. Roberts understood the critical importance of education and training, and his contributions to the study and practice of public diplomacy and global communication have significantly enhanced GW's leadership in this important area of learning. Since 2011, the Walter R. Roberts Endowment, which was created by the Roberts family and housed at the George Washington University, has hosted annual lectures with prominent foreign policy figures. We have with us tonight a number of members of the endowment's advisory board, including Admiral William and Patricia Roberts, board chair and GW professor Dr. Patricia Cabra, whom I believe was actually a member of Rick Stengel's staff at the State Department, Dr. Tom Miller, a former public affairs officer and instructor here at GW, and Dr. Sean Powers, who was the chair of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy before he moved to USAGM, the United States Agency for Global Media. We're so lucky to have our friend and colleague David Ensor as tonight's moderator. David is the director of the Project for Media and National Security, and among many other things, a former director of the Voice of America. So we are most grateful to him for agreeing to moderate tonight's program. A few quick notes. Tonight's program will begin with comments from our panel, which will be followed directly by a discussion with Mr. Ensor. We will end with questions from the audience, which we ask you to put in the question box, not the chat box. If you're interested in tweeting about the event, please use the hashtags Walter Roberts 2021 and public diplomacy. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and please enjoy the program. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Janet. This year, the annual Edelman Trust Barometer showed that of those polled in an international survey, 57% said the media are untrustworthy. The nonprofit Freedom House, which dates back to its foundation by Friends of Eleanor Roosevelt, tracks freedom around the world. And in this year's report, it says that globally, quote, the growing prominence of fake news and disinformation has fed into political polarization, contributing to a cycle of decreasing trust. And that's just one negative aspect of what the internet has wrought. It has also decimated the news business. In this country, over the past 10 years, more than half of the jobs in journalism have been lost. Local newspapers, local news media are in many places in free fall. Globally, over that same 10 years, over 780 journalists have been killed in the course of their work, hundreds more imprisoned, thousands more harassed and threatened. According to the World Press Freedom Index, prepared each year by Reporters Without Borders, China, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt are the world's biggest jailers of journalists. But since Donald Trump, the former US president, started to use the term fake news about news stories he didn't like, and started using Stalin's phrase, enemies of the people, about journalists he didn't like, many other leaders have felt free to do the same. Leaders like, obviously, Venezuela's Maduro and Russia's Putin, certainly, but also America's allies, Turkey's Erdogan, the Philippines' Duterte, Hungary's Viktor Orban. New York Times publisher A.J. Sulzberger has quite rightly called this a perilous moment for journalism. So, what can the Biden administration, what can the West do to protect and perhaps enhance global media freedoms? How can we be more effective at this? We have, as Janet mentioned, a really terrific panel here today to consider this, and also one other question, subsection question, since part of the answer surely lies in practicing what we preach, keeping our own media strong, and maintaining US-supported international media like the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe. So the secondary question for our panelists is, what should the Biden administration do with what is now called the US Agency for Global Media, which is the umbrella agency within which VOA, RFE, and others are situated? We're going to ask each panel to start by just giving us a few thoughts on the big question and the question within. And perhaps we'll turn first, if we may, to Richard Stengel, editor, author, former government official, and an MSNBC commentator. Rick was the editor of Time magazine from 2006 to 13. He was President Obama's Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, 2014 to 16. And he's the author of a number of books, including one that's titled Information Wars, How We Lost the Battle Against Disinformation and What to Do About It. Rick has recently been, and at least was recently, leading the Biden transition team for the US AGM. I understand he can't tell us too much about that. He's not allowed to, but still, I'm hoping he can give us some thoughts, not only on the broader question of how to protect global media, but also on where perhaps US AGM should go from here. So Rick, why don't you start by giving us a few thoughts?
David, thank you. And I'm delighted and honored to be here with a really terrific panel. I think I know everybody in the panel, and I want to also thank Janet for corralling all of us. It's a really worthy topic, and I'm going to jump in where you started and talk about that Freedom House survey of press freedom. But Freedom House also does a global survey of freedom and whether democracy is on the rise or decreasing around the world. And that survey has shown that democracy has been in retreat for the past 15 or 20 years. The countries that are considered, true representative democracies are declining. And although I may, insult my brethren in the press freedom is a function of whether democracy is rising or falling. Press freedom falls where democracy falls. It rises where democracy rises. And so it's not a cause and effect. The decline in press freedom, I suppose in some ways does cause a decline in freedom, but a decline in freedom really causes a decline in press freedom. We've seen the rise of illiberal democracies, the rise of authoritarian strongmen. We saw it even in our own United States of America, which became a model for other places. And a handmaiden of that, if I can use that expression, is the cranking down on press freedom, on a free press, on the use, as you mentioned it, of really odious terms like fake news, which has come to mean anything that you disagree with. And so this is a serious problem. And as David mentioned, I did work with the Biden transition, which was really a terrific effort and a real all-star team of people. And you're not supposed to talk about what happened there, but obviously, that ended on January 20th, and the Biden administration has done a whole lot of things since then, some of which were planned in the transition. And one of the cornerstones of Biden's foreign policy, which was talked about in the transition and which he will be talking more and more about it, is the promotion of democracy enhancement around the world. President Biden is going to have a democracy summit at the end of this year. Well, one of the foundations of that democracy summit is the promotion of a free press, of a liberal press, of a press that analyzes government actions, that is allowed to criticize governments. And I think you'll see as we go through the year that will be something that the Biden administration will be talking more and more about. But again, it is a subset in a way of this broader democracy promotion agenda. What I'd also say, and I don't mean to lessen the role of the free press, but there is a kind of continuum. And I think confident democracies have the freest press. Non-confident democracies, illiberal democracies have the least free press. And so one of the things that I saw when I was at the State Department and traveling all around the world and being the representing American public diplomacy and of course the promotion of a free press is that the US is a real outlier in ways both wonderful and in ways that are not. And David mentioned the number of journalists around the world who have lost their lives. I mean, the threat to US journalists is almost nothing compared to the threat of journalists in places like Myanmar and Turkey and Russia and China. I mean, those are people who are on the front lines of press freedom, who are really risking their lives, and they do extraordinary work. And I would put the journalists at VOA right at the top of that list. And so I think we have to remember that we're in many ways an exception, and even the First Amendment protections of the free press is also an outlier in ways both good and bad. But I think I've used up my time, and I'm eager to hear what everybody else has to say, and also take all of your questions. So thank you.
Great. Well, we'll get well into it shortly. But first, let's hear a few thoughts from you, Amanda. Amanda Bennett was the 29th director of the Voice of America from 2016 to 2020. So she was my successor at VOA. And we are, I like to think, personal friends. Amanda's had an extraordinarily impressive career in journalism. She was one of those at the Philadelphia Inquirer who won a Pulitzer Prize in 2001. She did over 2 decades at the Wall Street Journal. She was an executive editor of Bloomberg News, an editor of the Oregonian. She has served on the Pulitzer Board and on the board of the Committee to Protect Journalists. So Amanda Bennett is a journalist's journalist. Amanda.
Thank you, David. And you're right, but I've got a lot of colleagues on this phone call from my time at Voice of America. And while Rick Stengel says he was trying to insult, or trying not to insult journalists, I think he really succeeded in not insulting journalists. So I think that's really good, because I think one of the things this past couple of years here has shown is the actual value of a free press in creating a democracy. Now, Rick, you were saying that democracy leads to a free press, and I think there's a chicken and egg question. I think a free press also helps create democracies and sustain democracies, because otherwise there's no other way to explain why it is that societies, countries in decline, that the first thing that the authoritarian rulers go after is the press. I mean, there's no other reason that explains that, because that press is an instrument of democracy. So I believe that I believe more that the press is an instrument of democracy, and I'm very happy that democracy is a sustainer of a free press. I think both of those things are really really wonderful. But I think one of the things that we'll be able to talk about later is I believe that the events of the past 5 years have really showed how important these organizations such as USAGM, Voice of America, are in creating and sustaining democracies around the world. And I will say one particular thing, and that is, I was in China just when the country was opening up just after the Cultural Revolution. One thing that helped the country move forward was the fact that it still had a generation that remembered how to build factories, how to run factories, remembered how markets worked, remembered what university education used to be like. So Voice of America is not only a conveyor of free and fair and trustworthy information, it's also the proof to people around the world that a free press can exist. For many people in the world, they have no experience of a free press except what they see in organizations like Voice of America. And I think that is a single function that is underestimated when people think about Voice of America, which is not just what it's conveying to people and the trust that they have. And in contradiction to the numbers that you showed from Freedom House, Voice of America's trust numbers, even in places like Iran, are extraordinarily high. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but way over the 70%, maybe even over the 80% mark. It's very, very high. And the reason for that is people trust the content, and having a place that people can trust to tell them what is happening in the world is extraordinarily important.
Indeed. Well, let's have a few thoughts first now from you, Nick. Nick Cull is a historian and a professor in public diplomacy at the Annenberg School for Communications and Journalism at the University of Southern California, USC. And he's really one of the key go-to thinkers on public diplomacy that we all turn to. His writing and his interests are broad, They cover the role of advocacy, of exchange programs, of public opinion research, and of course, of broadcasting and media. And he's from the nation that gave the world the gold standard of international broadcasting, the BBC. So, Nick,
Okay,
please.
well, you've just conceded my first point. So okay, so first I want to thank Janet and the team at GW for this wonderful invitation, and to pay tribute, David, to you and my fellow panelists who've actually held this torch of media freedom that I just get to write about. And I'm really touched by the invitation because this series is named after Walter Roberts, who I came to know personally when I was researching my history of US public diplomacy, and he was influential on my thinking. And this is a subject that I care about. Researching VOA, I was much impressed by what came to be known in the newsroom as the struggle for truth, waged by amazing journalists, people like the great Bernie Kaminsky. And I know the meaning that the broadcasts from VOA, RFERL, and the other US broadcasters had on societies and for societies around the world in the past. Looking at free media as a historian, I can see a range of public diplomacy approaches that have been used in the past. And I think these approaches are mutually reinforcing, and each of them is a priority for our time, and bringing them together, reviving them must be a priority too. And so I've got 5. The first is external leadership, or you could call it norm building. Our leaders need to emphasize media freedom and stand by that principle, even when it's uncomfortable to do so. FDR's endorsement of media freedom in the run-up to Pearl Harbor now seems like a pivotal moment of global leadership. And part of the emergence of the international regime of rights that we see in the post-war world, even if journalists at the time grumbled about his disdain for their craft and his predilection for censorship. My second is platform building, creating or sustaining media in a vulnerable area. And I think here of the newspapers and magazines established by the US government in post-war Germany. Today, this kind of work is often done by collaborative funding, when multiple donors around the world get together to support free media outlets. I've taken a look at what's been happening in Ukraine, where Hromadski has been supported externally, or the excellent Ukrainian website Stop Fake, which fact checks claims and exposes distortions of truth originating generally in Kremlin media, but they do this in multiple languages. My third approach is surrogate journalism, where external media steps up and meets an unmet need within a society, and much of USAGM's output falls in this category. And I think we can see that this is an effective approach by the legal steps taken just this week in Russia to make it harder for RFERL to be seen and heard in that country. My fourth approach is professional development and network building. And here I'm thinking about the work done through the State Department's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, the International Visitor Leader Program, Morrow Fellows, Fulbright, and other work to strengthen the practice of journalism within vulnerable communities, empowering and connecting journalists to a global community of free media. My fifth approach is civil society development. The general enhancement of democratic structures, assistance with media literacy, higher education, including media and journalism education all around the world. And this too has historically been part of public diplomacy, not only of the US with the National Endowment of Democracy, but there's the UK's Westminster Foundation, aid to free media in the Eastern Bloc delivered by IREX, Internews, and so forth in the 1990s. And all of these kinds of projects need to be prioritized and coordinated. But there's a caveat to all this. International audiences are not stupid. They are great detectors of hypocrisy. And for leadership to be meaningful, it also has to be applied at home. And there was a shocking incongruity in the Trump administration's championing of free media in some places internationally, while aggressively seeking political control over US AGM outlets at home. One of the questions that came up in the prompt material was whether we should defer to our allies. And what do we do when our allied countries have unfree media? And I have a case in point. I was much impressed when the British government, during the tenure of Theresa May as Prime Minister, Jeremy Hunt as Foreign Secretary, initiated a global media freedom initiative, a high-profile conference with associated events. It was hosted in London with Canada as co-host back in the summer of 2019. Amal Clooney was the voice of the campaign. And that campaign made clear that media freedom was non-negotiable and that allies would be called out as readily as adversaries. Hunt had planned this initiative in the summer of 2018, before the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but it was his death, his murder, which convinced cabinet colleagues to support the campaign. And it was very embarrassing for allies like Saudi Arabia or UAE or Bahrain, where journalists are regularly jailed, that such issues were raised. But it's essential that governments stand by their values and that citizens hold their governments accountable too. And this opened problems for Britain. Britain was criticized by free media activists because it was holding Julian Assange on remand. The Johnson government has pulled back from this campaign. It's got other things to worry about. But the second iteration of the conference went ahead, co-hosted by Canada and Botswana. And Amal Clooney had to resign in protest over Britain violating international law during Brexit. But I think that story goes to show the importance of making a stand and of citizens being part of the conversation too. So I see it as a success. To wrap up on what I wanted to say, I see reputation as not just being an optional extra in diplomacy, but we have to think of it as a dimension of security. When a country's reputation is damaged, it becomes harder for it to act on the international stage. But standards by which that reputation are judged are culturally constructed. They come from the attitudes that people of the world hold. And it's only by talking about these values, by showing that they matter, by underlining them, that we can make those values significant. At the moment, Bahrain is able to argue that its security is served by jailing journalists, standing by values of media freedom, calling out the violators abroad and at home, flips the script. It makes jailing journalists a source of insecurity and imposes a cost on the behavior above just what you pay the jailers or the price of bread and water that you slip under the door each day. Maybe it's too much to expect that the president himself will call out such regimes on a daily basis, but what I hope President Biden will do is defend the right of credible firewalled broadcasters to do that job in multiple languages and support other elements of free media development and the kind of protections outlined above. And I believe Biden understands this. I'm heartened by his track record as a senator who really took care of RFE/RL in the 1990s. But I'm also heartened by Tony Blinken's track record of caring about these issues. I was just reading a piece he wrote in 2002 in the Washington Quarterly, where he emphasized the historical importance of public diplomacy and international broadcasting. And he says in that piece, it's time for the United States to rediscover its voice. And I agree with that. I think it's time for investment, it's time for principles, and it's also time for partnership. Free media matters, and it should be something on which all sides of the political spectrum can agree. So I hope this is something that we can build together going forward.
Thank you, Nick. I'm going to come back to the question of how to deal with allies that are not behaving well towards the media, but I think I'd better start with one of the most burning issues, in my view, at least in this whole area, and that is disinformation. You've written about this, Rick, so I'm going to come to you first with this. I mean, what should we do about it? Should there be a role for something? How should we respond to it? How should we control its impact if we can at all? Should there be
Um,
a role for something more edgy and pointed than conventional fact-checking or journalism in response to Russian and Chinese disinformation?
Thank you, David. Yes, that's in many ways the topic of my book, Information Wars.
Right.
And just to clarify it for everybody, because I think people argue about this, I define disinformation as false information that is used deliberately to deceive you. That's different than misinformation, which is something that may be wrong deliberately or mistakenly or an accident, which is also different than propaganda, which may or may use true or false information to support an ideological point of view. I mean, the rise of disinformation, I can't believe we got through our entire introductions without anybody mentioning Facebook or social media. But part of the problem of disinformation is that its availability. It's been around ever since, the Garden of Eden, but it's available now more because of social media, because there are no barriers to entry anymore. The Russians were the masters of disinformation in the 50s and 60s. They'd have to bribe a reporter at an Indian newspaper to make up a story, and then they would cover it in their own state newspapers and hope it gets picked up in the West. I mean, now, they just hire a few hundred young people and put them in a troll factory in St. Petersburg. It costs a lot less than than an F-18 jet. So we do see more of it. Now, part of what I write about in the book is I really underwent a sea change when I was in government. I reacted originally to the rise of Russian disinformation, and I write about ISIS's disinformation, doing the thing that people in Washington do, which is how do you counter it, Mr. Undersecretary?
Right.
And I thought, yes, we've got to counter it. How do we counter it? And the original way we all thought, well, we counter it by, they say your mother wears army boots, so we say your mother wears army boots. I'm dating myself with that insult, but it's very PG. So we even had mechanisms within the State Department, the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communication. And in Washington, people think if you put the word counter in front of a noun, you're doing something about it. But the more I realized, David, when I was in government, was that government was often the worst messenger for that counter disinformation message that we wanted. Why? Because people distrusted us. It's like the cognitive backfire effect, where if someone has a very strongly held belief and you try to disabuse them of it, it only strengthens that belief. Well, when government does that, it strengthens it even more, because they say, yes, you are the source of the real disinformation, and you're trying to hide it. So the long and the short of it is, we did, out of CSCC, we created something called the Global Engagement Center, which originally was meant to counter disinformation globally. And it has moved away, and I think it's the right decision to move away from actually being a messenger, creating content itself to counter disinformation, which I actually do not think is government's job. Not only because government is bad at it, but because it undermines itself. So they track disinformation, they bring it to the attention of the Secretary of State and other officials, and I think the job of countering disinformation, and I don't want to get bogged down in this because we could talk about it all evening, the job of countering disinformation is really with the private sector. And there are, I think it was, I don't know, David, did you talk about, or Nick mentioned, somebody mentioned Stop Fake, for example, in Ukraine. I mean, these private companies that are on their own doing it are better at it than the USG, and they have more credibility than the USG.
Yeah, indeed. Well, you mentioned the private sector. I wonder what any of the panelists think the role of private companies like Facebook and Google should be in combating dis and misinformation, and whether or not further regulation of the internet is desirable and or likely. Anyone got a thought on that? Well, Rick, maybe we're back to you.
Okay, I'm going to jump in, and I'll shoot my thing first, and everybody can come in. I do think I write a lot about it at the end of the book, Section 230, which has become very well known in the last 4 or 5 years, in part because people like Donald Trump would tweet, abolish Section 230. So for those who don't know or need to be reminded, Section 230 is a part of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, many years before Facebook, many years before these big social media platforms. It was the era of MySpace, if anybody remembers that. But what Section 230 did, and it was a visionary idea of Congress, which is they said these are platforms that exist because of content not created by professional journalists, but by everyday people. They can't be as liable for the content they publish as the Philadelphia Inquirer or CNN or Time Magazine. So they basically gave them a get out of jail free card. They don't have any liability for any of the content on their platforms. One of the biggest things that can be done, and I think there's a bipartisan support for this, is to give them more liability for the content that they publish. Not the same liability that Time Magazine has or CNN, but that they have to make a good faith effort to take down disinformation, misinformation, to really abide by their terms of service, which are their own constitution. So that's my one size fits all solution. I know there are many others, but I just wanted to get that out there.
One thing I do want to jump in on, David, is approaches to disinformation, and looking back on how the U.S. government dealt with Soviet disinformation in the 1980s, we shouldn't forget that one of the most effective approaches in that period was negotiation and tying the progress in tying an end to disinformation to other things that the Soviets actually wanted. So there's this moment in 1987 when Sievert Kup, the Surgeon General, is empowered to say to the Russians, you want to cooperate on AIDS, you stop saying that AIDS is an American bioweapon. And by tying disinformation into other elements of the peace process, it was possible to turn off the worst elements of Soviet disinformation for a 3-year period until the government actually started to lose control over its own security services. It's so easy to say that media has become weaponized. And I think this is true, but when we have a weapon in our world, we need a disarmament process. And this has worked in the past to negotiate over. There was a very interesting project between historians in the USSR and the US to look at each other's textbooks and take out stuff that was wrong in the textbooks. I think we should go back to thinking about that once again. We have to have an all-around approach to this problem, and not just certainly not just see it in terms of we need to come up with smarter lines on Twitter, which some people advocate. Take their gloves off, hit them where it hurts. I think that would be disastrous. And above all, I'm heartened that when I've been in conversations about responses, nobody is saying we've got to make stuff up about them. We have to be about integrity, and I think it's so heartening that the values of VOA, news values of VOA, are understood overseas. And to me, this is the cure, is going to be that if the world becomes about passing news from person to person to person, we're going to start to evaluate the news based on its brand, same way we evaluate the bottle of water we have based on its brand. And people come to know that the BBC, VOA, RFERL are reliable brands, and they also know the brands that are tendentious. And as audiences become more familiar, as they learn to live in the social media universe, I think that the system will start to readjust. And I can see similar periods of adjustment happening after the explosion of the popular press, after the coming of radio and newsreel, that it takes there's a lag until the skepticism of the public catch up, until people learn to be consumers of news and the media world stabilize. But it's a dangerous moment, and having this conversation is an important part of regaining that stability. So I'm really glad that we're talking in this way about these issues.
But I'm sure, Amanda, that you felt some of this. I did before you. Frustration about it. You were running a large news organization that was seeking to be a truth teller. But you know, as the expression goes, a lie gets up and goes around the world 3 times before the truth gets out of bed, right? And it's very difficult to use something as bland as the truth against really colorful lies and get any kind of traction. Didn't you find that?
Well, and that's obviously one of the big, crack cocaine of social media, which is that you can make things really fascinating. You find that outrage moves across Twitter much faster than information. So you're absolutely right. Although I was going to accept that my colleague Nick just said the same thing himself. I was going to brand what I was about to say as a optimistic innocence here, because I think that what Rick said about the psychological effect of pushing back, everyone, and I see this in the entire political system right now, pushing back and fighting and going against it is very psychologically satisfying. You feel like you stood up for something, you've punched out the bully, and everything is great. But it does apparently, based on, I've made a little hobby of reading the psychological research on this subject, really tends to harden views, even if the people actually intellectually believe what you're saying. So yeah. My view was that, even if it is more spinach-like than cotton candy, my view was you flood the zone. You flood the zone, and the word brand was something I had in my head, that there is actually a market for brand stuff. And even in the most skeptical people, you can see, I'm on one of these neighbors apps that where people are like talking about the break-ins and the bad people going around and the people who don't pick up after their dogs. And there's a whole section of the neighbors things called like, what's that boom? Like something just boom, and they always turn to the brand media to answer the question when there's something they really want to know the answer to. So I think that this is not as, it's clearly very addictive, this kind of false news. But I also think that there is a degree of appeal to something that is calm, that you can trust, that you can turn to when there's an emergency. You can see it from the trust numbers that we get. And I just was informed that the trust numbers of VOA Persian are above 85%. So think about that for a moment and think about
a funny thing. Back in 2008, I was tracking what Russians were saying about South Ossetia, and they were very angry with the BBC. Until the BBC had a story that was sympathetic to the Russian point of view. And then they suddenly said, oh, and we can trust the BBC. So, given the chance, they will even the Kremlin media will affirm, the trustworthiness of these outlets.
So if I were running the distribution of budget, attention, manpower, and passion, I would shift things very much. I mean, the fact that the truthful, reliable news sector is shrinking so much around the world, including in this country, I think is a huge problem. I would move all the efforts towards creating more of the good stuff and less of the efforts towards fighting the bad stuff. Even though the fighting the bad stuff really does get people's heart pumping. It's like, oh, we're really doing something. I would not do that.
Back in World War II, where there was a problem of rumor within the United States that was the US government felt it was threatening the war effort, they didn't, they found it was best not to rebut rumors directly, because it would tell people who hadn't heard the rumor what the rumor was.
Right.
What worked was to listen to the rumor, work out the concern that was being emphasized in the rumor, and then find something that everybody could agree with that they could unite behind. So most American rumors in World War II, civilian rumors, were about race. So they found, rather than saying, no, it's not true that if you're Jewish, you don't have to serve in the US Army, they said, let's make patriotic films with integrated bomber crews, platoons, and that everybody will be rooting for an integrated group of Americans. So sell the positive, find the ways where we can work together and talk about that. And that's how you do it psychologically, not by scoring points and getting into a he said, she said slanging match.
let me now come to the question of allies, because this one really bothers me, and I have a specific example I'd like to ask you. You know, as you mentioned, Nick, some allied nations like Turkey, Hungary, or Poland now have illiberal governments that seek to silence media voices they don't like. And my question really for you all is, how should that affect our relationships with them? How much should it affect? The example of Poland is the one I know best. I have a Polish wife, and I spent a lot of time as a journalist in Poland. I care about the place. It's an important NATO ally, which needs to worry about Russia just next door, and which has been a strong contributor to forces in Afghanistan and elsewhere. It's a real ally. And yet, the Polish government has threatened to impose a punitive new tax aimed at newspapers and channels that are partly or fully owned by foreigners, which includes Gazeta Wyborcza, the biggest newspaper in the country, and an editorial voice that frequently criticizes the right-wing populist government. And it also includes TVN24, a news channel owned by the American Discovery Group. It's pretty much down the middle editorially in a nation where the government has turned Polish state television into a total right-wing propaganda channel. So how should the Biden administration react if the Polish government moves against the last remaining independent media and what's supposed to be a NATO ally? Should that bring other questions to bear other than just, you know, we don't like it and we denounce it? What do you think, Rick?
So it's an excellent question. It's a difficult issue. After spending my whole life as a journalist and then going into the State Department, I was frankly kind of delighted and empowered by finding out that, you know, the things that the U.S. says it does behind the scenes, it actually does. You know, I was in meetings with President Obama, with Vice President Biden, many meetings with the Secretary of State, with some of the countries that you've mentioned, where those American actors bring up these things in meetings with their head of state or their equivalent of the Secretary of State. They don't always talk about it publicly, but they almost always talk about it privately. You know, since Jimmy Carter, you know, and by the way, with the exception of Donald Trump, I mean, human rights has been an issue that every Secretary of State talks about wherever he goes. And I just also want to mention, I think Nick mentioned a piece that Tony Blinken wrote in 2002. I mean, Tony Blinken was a journalist. He understands what journalists do and what they go through. This is something that is very top of mind with him. And if it's not always in a communique, it's always talked about in private. And again, I think Nick mentioned the diplomacy with the Soviet Union around AIDS, where, you know, the Russian disinformation that AIDS was a U.S. bioweapon. The fact that a U.S. official brought it up with his Russian counterpart is the kind of thing that actually happens. And I do think that we're big boys and big girls in diplomacy, and even among allies, whether it's Poland, whether it's Turkey. We have to bring up these issues, and those countries actually expect us to bring them up. And I think we have to use the leverage that we have to, you know, make sure that they understand why a free press is a foundation of a modern democracy.
But this goes to something that builds on what you said. The last element of any argument over disinformation has to be not fulfilling the stereotype. And if we want to go out and say we believe in a free press, we have to defend that at home. If we want to go out and say we oppose corruption, we can't have officials taking, we have to clamp down on corruption. And, I think it's really important that we understand the things that are being said about us. And this has been a problem for the US historically, because, you know, Eisenhower became concerned about civil rights primarily because Khrushchev was talking about it. And he realized if this country is going to have a shot at defending freedom in the world, it has to defend freedom at home. So being aware of what our faults are, what is being criticized, of the kind of issues that are being raised in disinformation, and making sure that those are not, we're not providing easy targets for ourselves, but are really working to put the negatives behind is an essential element in, if you want to call it counter propaganda, not being the reality that's being depicted. And and that has worked, again, that has worked in the past. It's the biggest thing to undercut Soviet propaganda was by not being as racist a country as it was at the beginning of the 1950s, actually working to deal with those problems as they are raised.
If I could piggyback on that, though, that is the greatest challenge to American public diplomacy when it comes to a free press. We've just gone through 4 years of a president who, as you said, David, at the beginning, called the press the enemies of the people, called anything he disagreed with fake news. That has undermined our public diplomacy in that realm in a way that is really difficult to overcome. And I think, I mean, well, I think our whole conversation is going in this direction because I do think one of the challenges for USAGM in general and Voice of America in particular is after you've gone through something like this, how do you kind of resuscitate the US's image? And I think, the best example of American public diplomacy has been the American example. It's not the example of our power, President Biden has said over and over, but the power of our example. That we have to start showing that. And I think, USAGM is one of those places that we can do that. I'm teeing it up for you now, Amanda.
Thank you. That pitched me a softball right over the plate.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
But you know what? I actually find that this period was extremely clarifying in a couple of different ways. One was that the American people, because this is not like BBC where it's broadcast in English and available to people to see at home, we're unable to really see very distinctly what it is VOA and RFE, because most of the work is done in other languages. So I think there was a widespread public skepticism, and I know this from my own journalistic colleagues. When I arrived at USAGM, everyone would say to me, and pretty widely, Amanda, after this wonderful journalistic career you had, why did you want to go and work in propaganda? And I said, well, I didn't actually, but this period of time, because you watched in real time, VOA, the whole of USAGM, RFE, RFA, all acting and behaving in a certain way that everyone found very familiar, like keeping with the program that they were supposedly doing. I think that helped a lot to clarify for the American public what the role was. I'll tell you the other thing that people tend to underestimate is I didn't really know when I came to USAGM what the word civil society meant. It's not a term that I had been just bandying around, but you go to go out to non-democratic countries and you hear the term about let's develop civil society. The role that civil society played in defending USAGM for attempts to use it was miraculous. Yeah. It was miraculous. It was organizations that stood up. It was the press that stood up. It was the courts that stood up. It was the people that filed at great risk to themselves, whistleblower suits using the mechanisms of government. I think that was a really wonderful example of what we mean by the power of civil society. And the reason civil society stood up for it is that there was a widespread feeling that a free press, a press that is separate, maybe funded by the US government, but is separate from the US government, and whose message you can trust because it's not a message, it's actually reporting. I think that was very deeply felt inside many, many institutions in the United States. And I think there's a huge lesson there that I think this was a very clarifying moment. And so let me just go do one more thing, because I'll toss it right back at both of you. And that is that I know that there has been a struggle over the past, I don't even know how many years, at least as long as I would look back on it, to say what should be the role of US funded media. And there's been some feeling that there's a piece of it that should be an instrument of US foreign policy. I always agreed with that. I thought it should be an instrument of US foreign policy because it exported the best of US values. And that meant it had to be separate from the government, should not be associated with the State Department, should not be controlled by the State Department. But I know there's always been a tug saying, you belong to us, you should come into the State Department, you should be a messaging operation. Well, I think we've all seen exactly what it looks like when it attempts to become a messaging operation. It's not positive for the US image overseas. It's not positive for the US image domestically. It's really bad. I think it's clarifying in the third way, in that it's made the independence of US media and obviously all the other free country media that includes the BBC. I think it's been very clarifying about why that is so important, and that it should retain a very powerful journalistic role in the best traditions of American journalism, which is factual, objective, truthful, and nonpartisan.
But
Nothing,
here,
nothing impresses foreigners so much in many countries where they don't have a free press as when we're honest about our own country.
right.
When
That's the
Voice of
most
America,
American thing.
when I was director, was running stories about Black Lives Matter and about young Black men being shot by police, which hasn't stopped, that coverage, I could see the numbers in Iran, in Russia. That builds credibility when you're honest about your own faults. So I just think it's incredibly powerful. But
sorry, David, I wanted to come in on this because I think we have to be really careful here. What we're talking about is promoting America in the ethical sense. We're not talking about waving the flag or saying this is the greatest country. And part of the problem is that on Capitol Hill, what they think they're paying for is something that is promoting America, the strength, the ways in which this is the most wonderful country, and a kind of a rather vulgar advertising agenda. But I think if we can step back and think of the challenge as a challenge of American values, and values that other countries can promote just as well, maybe even better than the United States right now, then we can think about this collaboratively. And I found this really interesting document in the Jimmy Carter papers. He wrote to Margaret Thatcher and said to her, Mrs. Thatcher, do not cut back the BBC World Service. It's a really important part of our collective pushback against the Soviet Union. Now, the idea of Jimmy Carter lecturing Mrs. Thatcher on standing firm is very interesting, but sometimes countries don't realize the significance of one of their own institutions, and providing all around support and seeing this as a collective activity, I think, would make it stronger, and taking some of the narrow patriotism out of it, because I don't think that's particularly helpful to try and advertise a narrowly American brand of media freedom, when the truth is that media freedom is for everyone, and criticizing the United States has to be part of free media. Criticizing Britain has to be part of free media coming out of those places.
let me just say that we're getting a lot of really good questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to start asking you some of them in a minute. But I want to just ask first a couple of things of you and Amanda and Rick. I was watching kind of with almost holding my breath as you were director of the Voice of America under President Donald Trump. How long can she do this? And what was it like? And how much damage did Michael Pack do, in your opinion?
Well, let me try and answer that. There was a lot of damage done. There was a lot of damage done. It's not irreparable, but again, I like to look at what also the thing that people don't see is how much benefit came out of it. There was a lot of damage done, but I think that the people at Voice of America, at USAGM in general, RFA, showed themselves. They had not been tested in this way in a very long time, and they were tested and they came through it. I found that people did stand up for their values, the values that they had said that they had held, and they discovered they actually do hold them. So I think there was a lot of really wonderful things that have come out of it, clarifying things. That the damage is all in the financial, the bureaucratic, the systems that got broken, the things that, I mean, if it had been ideological, I might have understood it a little better, but it didn't seem to be in service of any ideology from where I was looking. It just seemed to be kind of random breaking things.
Yeah.
So I couldn't deduce any pattern to it. So a lot of stuff got broken. A lot of windows got, a lot of glass got broken. On the other hand, going forward, I really would like that people not forget that something really fundamentally wonderful happened. And that is that the people who said they believed something turned out to find out that whenever they were under pressure, they actually did. And that is a wonderful, wonderful outcome.
Yeah. And Rick, I'm going to ask you, I might as well, how should USAGM and specifically VOA be resourced and organized in your view? What's the right road going forward for that, do you think?
So, no, I'm happy to talk about it, David. And I just also want to applaud Amanda's comments. I think she's exactly right. I think the people at USAGM stood up for their values. I mean, they're journalists. They stood up for free press, for fact-based, evidence-based journalism. They went ahead and wrote the stories that other people weren't writing. And I think it's a very good example, despite the macro damage that Michael Pack in particular in the last administration did. I have to say, so, and David, you know this, and when I was undersecretary, the undersecretary for public diplomacy is on the board of what was then known as BBG, maybe the worst acronym in all of government, but which became USAGM. And so I was the representative of the secretary on the board, and I found myself fascinated by US international broadcasting in a way I hadn't expected, and thought I knew something about it. I have to say, during the 2 month or 2.5 month period that I was on the Biden transition looking at USAGM, I realized I knew nothing about it at all beforehand. I shouldn't admit that. But that it really also changed my view of the mission of USAGM. And even though our job was, what is the first things that you should do in the first 100 days? And by the way, the team that is in there now, Keilu Chow as acting CEO and Brian Conniff, who as chief operating officer, has been absolutely sensational. I mean, it's just gone miraculously well, in part due to those two people, and also the goodwill they generate and the bona fides of the people there. But people kept coming back to, in all of our discussions, what is the mission of USAGM? And it's something that people care deeply about, and they argue a lot about. And I have to say, my position changed a little bit about it, because while, for example, I would like VOA to be a better news organization than CNN, its mission isn't to be better than CNN. Its mission is not simply to be a journalistic organization. If you look at the mission statements of all of these agencies, their mission is is to use journalism. Journalism is the means to help promote democracy and free thinking and free press and these values, which are universal values around the world. Its mission is not just to do good journalism. That is the means by which it will promote these other things. And I more and more came to believe that during the course of the transition, because I mean, while it would be great to have a better news service, more news services than CNN or BBC or whatever, that isn't the job of USAGM. The job of USAGM is to do those stories in those parts of the world that the local press isn't able to do because the local press is being repressed. The rival of USAGM is not CNN or BBC. The rival of USAGM are those authoritarian governments that are repressing a free press in those countries. That is what USAGM, in a way, is designed to combat. And that fact-based journalism is the thing that does it.
And you know something, Rick, I would say that nobody outside of VOA and USAGM ever thinks that the rival was CNN, because the only place you can see CNN is in the hotel in the middle of the city that you come to that costs you $250 a night. So everybody in VOA was coming from those own markets where they understood what the needs of their markets were. They were doing it in their own languages, and the picture of the United States was not jingoistic. It's one of these things where you and I and other people that talk about the role of exporting American values can agree, but it's only when you get down to the specifics about what we actually mean by that. And I thought that you should fulfill people's interest in what happens in the United States. And there are people, believe it or not, throughout the entire last 4 years, people were fascinated about the United States, fascinated, and not just about the bad stuff. They wanted to know what the diaspora was doing in the United States. How are people like me doing here? What's going on with this policy? What's going on, with the people in Congress? Are they speaking out against this? They were fascinated. They wanted to know about the medical system in the United States, because half their doctors had come here years ago. They wanted to know about our education system. They wanted to know how they could get their kids into American colleges despite what was going on. So, I felt that you could cover it completely journalistically. It was in fact a complete journalistic organization. You just had to know your market. So the idea that you want to be something other than a journalistic organization, you want to, kind of massage your content to show America in its best light. I don't think that's right at all. I think you act as a journalistic organization, you know your market, and you feed the needs of your market.
And it can be really powerful when VOA pulls up something that's a problem in the US and a problem overseas, especially when international audiences don't know it's a problem. And I'm thinking here about the award-winning series on forced marriage.
Exactly. I was just thinking about that. Exactly.
That series was an astonishing series, an amazing expose of forced marriage in the rural United States. And
forced child marriage, 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds. And you know something, before the first month of that series that was out there, it was seen by 10 million people.
Wow.
And the comments from people in 47 different languages on the things that were going out over social media were like pages and pages and pages long. You want to talk about engagement in the subject? Mm-hmm. Way beyond my expectations.
That's great.
And wasn't it the coverage of the Uyghurs that was done by Radio Free Asia that really catapulted that story into
Absolutely. They basically discovered that question. Absolutely. Yes. That's
absolutely true. Well, we got a lot of good questions, as I mentioned, so I'm going to ask a few of them. And I just have to recognize one or two questioners too. Ismail Dahiyat, one of the great VOA broadcasters and leaders, asks, what has been the impact of COVID on democracy and press freedom overseas? And how can the US help when its own democracy and press have been assaulted and damaged at home in the last few years? Thoughts?
Well, we have talked a little bit about the latter part of that question, because I think it has been damaged. And again, the way you undo the damage is just by doing great journalism and great reporting and showing what we do. But I want to address the COVID issue because it's come up in a backhanded way. One of the things after doing this previous book that I've been thinking about for another book is things like why does disinformation flourish? Why do conspiracy theories flourish? Well, there's a lot of great scholarship about how conspiracy theories are on the rise when people are more insecure. Conspiracy theories are on the rise during pandemics, which make people less secure. So it's one of these things that we've seen increase because as people feel less insecure and less able to control their own destiny, they are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories that have fantasies about how their destiny is being controlled. And so again, to steal Nick's phrase, which people in government use, and my corrective to Amanda's criticism, democracy and a free press are mutually reinforcing. And in fact, overcoming the pandemic, being transparent about how we do it, all of those things will, I hope in the long run, lead to a decline of disinformation and conspiracy theories as people begin to be healthier and more secure. And I'm an optimist, by the way.
Here's another question from Donna Oglesby. Since the GOP and allied media like Fox, Newsmax, and OAN collaborate as useful idiots or partners, she says, with Russian disinformation efforts, according to the ODNI, how can the United States be credible on this issue in international relations? Why should allies or adversaries believe anything the current administration says on this issue will endure beyond Biden's term, given how polarized our society now is?
An American needs to, well, I'm an American, but a real American has to answer that one, I think.
All right. Well, I talk a lot about Russian disinformation in my book. And the thing about the Russians and Russian disinformationists is they're not original. They don't actually create conspiracy theories or disinformation on their own. They amplify what is already out there. And Nick mentioned, I think, David, you mentioned too about what the Russians did about repression of Blacks and racism in America in the 50s and 60s. Well, they didn't create that. That was existing. They amplified it. And so one of the things in this kind of ecosystem of Fox News and OAN and Russia Today is they are mutually reinforcing. The Russians are not creating that stuff. The Russians are looking at it and amplifying it. And if we look at what the Internet Research Agency did in St. Petersburg, I mean, you know, they were successful despite the fact that those people couldn't spell in English, had terrible grammar, because they were reinforcing prejudices and biases and conspiracy theories that Americans already believed.
Yeah.
Donna asks a really important question. And what I hope is that the particular political situation around President Trump, with people being scared to go against him, will come to an end, and that there are some sensible people on the Republican side, and that those people can be brought into the conversation too, because this has to be bipartisan. We have to have everybody working to ensure the integrity of media. And to me, it's very sad that media here is so driven domestically by profit, and people seek out profits by going to extremes. And the extremes are going against the benefit of the country as a whole. But I've come to this country as an adult, and maybe you have to be born here to really understand why that's a great idea.
I mean, you talk about media being driven to, it's clicks also. I mean, Facebook rewards people who get more clicks for what they put on Facebook. And
the algorithm
and the lies, the algorithms. I mean, I just don't think we're going to go too much longer without more regulation of what algorithms are allowed to do. But I may be wrong. There aren't too many people in Congress who understand this stuff yet, so I may be wrong. Let me ask another question here from the list. Matthew Wallen asks, what can we do to better protect the various USAGM institutions and the premise of free and accurate reporting through those institutions, considering how close we came to losing their protection under the Trump administration? We frequently talk about the VOA charter, but given the deliberate decisions to begin ignoring it, is it strong enough? What can we do to make it stronger?
I can speak a little bit to that. And one of the things that, like, my tenure overlapped by about 3 years, the previous administration. And one of the things we were surprised to find is many things that we believed were our legal protections were actually simply normative. And for people that don't recognize norms, that's not enough. I believe that there are some things that should be handled legislatively to cement the idea that this is an independent journalistic organization that, while funded by the US government, is not housed in the US government, is not influenced by the US government, and not cannot be overtaken by the US government. And I believe that a single leader structure was a bad idea from the very beginning, no matter whose hands it was in. A single leader of an organization like a news organization like USAGM, with no accountability to anyone whatsoever outside the organization, is not a good idea, no matter who's running the country. So something has to be done to fix that. And that does remind me of a thing that I'd like to make sure that everyone thinks about. It's a perfect example. When you change something legally, please think about in whose hands it's going to be implemented. It's not necessarily going to be implemented by you or the people that you trust and believe. You've got to have something. That's what a democracy is all about. You've got to have something that can work when it's in the hands of anybody. And that's not what happened in this organization.
And I think that's a terrific point. And by the way, we saw when it came to plenty of other agencies, like the Defense Department, like the Justice Department, that what were norms, what we thought were laws, were actually norms. And if you have an administration that doesn't observe norms, then all that goes to heck. I would just say about protecting USAGM, and again, I can say this in part from my experience in the transition. Remember, it was then Senator Biden and his aide future Senator Ted Kaufman, who basically rewrote the legislation around U.S. international broadcasting in the 90s, and basically created BBG. Ted Kaufman was on the first BBG board. They will be the first to tell you, and they will use this word over and over, is that USAGM is independent. It doesn't take orders from the President of the United States. It doesn't take orders from the Secretary of State. Tony Blinken knows that. And I think anything that reinforces the independence of USAGM, yes, this is government supported, but it's independent of government. That is the way that we all need to go.
Absolutely. I mean, I would just say that where government does play a role is in deciding what our budget is and telling us which countries to do. You know, I remember the Obama White House saying, you know, what can you do in Mali? We've got a crisis in northern Mali. People are panicking. You know, what can you do cheap and fast? You know, and we figured out how to start a new Bambara service, which had an incredible impact on the people in southern Mali in terms of reassuring them that the rebels were not 10 feet tall and they weren't coming straight for the capital, which was honest information that we gathered carefully. So I think it made a huge difference. So it's okay for the government to tell us, you know, what are your where are you going to do journalism? Towards what audiences do we feel it's important? That's a legitimate political question, which I'm comfortable with politicians deciding, because that's the power of the purse, right? But then when it comes to how do you do journalism, please leave it to the professionals. You know,
yes, exactly.
That's always my thought. Michael Anderson asks, and this is for you, Rick, obviously, since we're all waiting for the appointment of the next Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, there hasn't been one in several years. What should that role be now? So, I've just lost the writing. Somebody just flicked away from me. I'm sorry. Anyway, that's basically the question. What should that role be in the Biden administration? What would you advise?
So it's a good question, and I think there's been a lot of learning over the past 4 years during the previous administration. I think and would hope that person is conversant with modern media, with social media, which has become in so many ways the public square. I think to make an even larger point, I think part of the Biden administration's foreign policy is this democracy promotion idea, which I think you will hear more about. And I do think that in many ways, the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy is in the democracy promotion business, and that we should be using public diplomacy not to, you know, tell America's story, as the cliche goes, but to help countries become more democratic, to help protect a free press, to help people determine their own destiny around the world. I mean, those aren't just American values, those are universal values. And I think the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy is uniquely positioned in the US government to be able to help do those things. And I think and believe that's what they're thinking about.
Yeah. Sean Powers, a name many of us know. Thanks you all for your comments today and for your support for free press, but asks if you could build USAGM from scratch today, what would it look like and what would be different?
You're going to hate me, Amanda. My fantasy is put it somewhere other than in Washington, D.C., because then you'd have 2 senators who cared about it. And you know, I've learned that much about American politics, that you know, if VOA was run out of Atlanta, or maybe even back in the day, if it had been in Knoxville, it would have had a senator who really cared about it on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The fact that RFERL was constituted in Delaware meant that Biden was going to care about it, and the sad reality of American politics is that the legislators care most about the things that are in their constituencies. So maybe that would be, if I was designing it from scratch, and it was originally, VOA was in New York City, right? It was just that the journalists were too left wing, too out there in the first iteration of VOA. They had to be brought into Washington, D.C. and pulled into line.
And you know what? I won't hate you. I'll piggyback onto it. I'll take it in a different part of the country, but it's got to be in a brand new building with modern digital capacity and great windows.
Oh, good. Well, LA then.
Yeah, there you go. LA.
Maybe students from the Annenberg School could start it.
Needs a modern broadcasting platform for a modern industry.
Of course, yeah.
But by the way, I would also say, and I think David and Amanda, you would agree with me, there's a lot more than 2 senators support USAGM. It's one of the few things that is bipartisan, has always been bipartisan. It gets support across the aisle.
Broad support across the aisle. I was really amazed and grateful for it. Absolutely broad, and Knoxville was actually among them.
Just going to read from Ambassador Brian Carlson. Eisenhower put America's most respected journalist, Edward R. Murrow, in charge. Clinton nominated his White House Deputy Chief of Staff, Evelyn Lieberman. Bush, being, quote, outcommunicated by some guy in a cave, unquote, sent his communication director, Karen Hughes, to be Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy. Will Biden and Blinken nominate someone they really know and really trust to lead U.S. public diplomacy? The job's been vacant 40% of the time since 1999.
I think, having looked at this historically, the most valuable thing for because public diplomacy is always contested, it doesn't have the automatic constituency that the military have. It doesn't have the automatic prestige that the State Department has. It starts on the back foot. The most successful episodes in US public diplomacy have not been when the director has prestige, but when the director has friendship with the president. So Charles Wick was, because he was so close a friend of Ronald Reagan, he could get things done. People looked for an easier target within domestic politics, and he could get the budget to do the things that he felt needed to be done in the 1980s. And Karen Hughes was able to do some really positive things with US public diplomacy because she had that friendship, that trust with George W. Bush. Ed Murrow, I think he was great in his own terms, but he didn't have an intimate relationship with Kennedy, and this goes for other countries too. I could talk about other places. The relationship between Winston Churchill and Brendan Bracken really helped British international projection during World War II. So this is if you can get somebody who's a friend, who has that personal connection to the president, it certainly helps.
Yeah. Here's a sort of a journalist kind of question from me. When nations restrict or kick out American journalists that are trying to cover them, should the US retaliate in kind ever?
That's the angels dancing on the head of a pin question. It always has been, even among journalists. And you can see when we were about to be kicked out of Russia, how much of the foreign policy is going to rest on doing something meaningful to counter that, and how much can it? And when all the journalists got kicked out of China, VOA got kicked out along with the New York Times and the other journalists. What could you do? And what do you want to do? I think journalists themselves are very, very cautious about adopting that, like, as you said, you don't adopt the we'll tell falsehoods about them, adopting the anti-journalistic policies of the people that use them against us. And that puts us in a little bit of a bind.
Could I jump in on this? Because yeah. I think that part of what we have to look at here is why have they done it? And there's a mantra in parenting that behavior is communication, and bad behavior by a nation state that they're trying to say something just as surely as if they were putting out a press release, and there is some very strange behavior going on now from some countries, actively harassing journalists, harassing diplomats, and we have to try and work out what's going on and how to deal with that, to confront that. But a bilateral expulsion may be exactly the wrong thing to do. But trying to read what's going on is important. I'm thinking here, in the 80s, what it meant when Nicholas Danilov was arrested and accused of spying. That was a really interesting moment, a really interesting crisis that to me revealed that there were people in the Kremlin who didn't want reconciliation with the United States, which is a really interesting thing to realize at that particular moment.
Yeah.
So this behavior is communication. We've got to think, well, what are they doing here? And it'll be something beyond just removing that particular journalist.
Yeah.
In diplomacy, the fancy term for that is reciprocity. And it's, been practiced, since the Peloponnesian Wars. And I do think that you can go down a non-useful path if you reciprocate by becoming the thing that you're criticizing. If China throws out American journalists and we reciprocate by throwing out Chinese journalists, then we're doing the same thing. I think it sends a message when we say, you know what? We don't like you kicking out your journalists. You're repressing a free press. We don't do that in this country. That's why we're not doing the same thing to you.
But equally, we can use the power of negotiation to try and negotiate mutual visibility. One of the stories I love from the USIA in the 80s is that they negotiated mutual access for documentary film crews so that Russian documentary film crews could come to the US and film what they wanted. And the Russians immediately decided they were going to do a documentary on homelessness in New York City. And so they were going around taking these pictures of homeless people on the streets of New York. But when that was shown on Russian TV, what people were interested in was the fantastic cars that were going by. And the thing completely backfired. And openness, bottom line is openness has to be our friend. And
Well,
that's what, in a way, that's what this is all about. This conversation is all about.
Yeah, one more from me. The Chinese budget for soft power. I mean, everything from Confucius Institutes to that incredible building in Beijing, from which Chinese international broadcasting is run. I mean, the effort is by many estimates 5 to 6 times as large as the United States. So I guess, Rick, first, let me ask you: should we be taking this more seriously? Should there be a serious budget increase and serious effort put into U.S. international broadcasting, or some other effort in public diplomacy designed to recognize what we're up against, the long-term challenge of China?
I think it is being recognized. I mean, if you look at what Tony Blinken has said at the State Department in his early meetings, I mean, there's a real awareness of China venturing into this territory, spending lots of money. But again, we began by saying that in government, you think you're doing something about it if you put the word counter in front of it. I'm not so sure that we need to counter Chinese public diplomacy with a necessary budget increase of our public diplomacy, even though I'm always in favor of that. I mean, to me, the greatest term for U.S. public diplomacy is American soft power. That has been our secret sauce for the last 75 years. And I mean, I would put American soft power, whether it's Hollywood or TV or sports or social media, whatever you have, against however many billions the Chinese are spending on public diplomacy. I like our side. And so I don't think the answer is necessarily spending more. And I think, again, to Nick's point and the point we've been making all along, that openness is our friend. Transparency is our friend. Showing how we do things is the greatest public diplomacy that we can do. And that's something I'm afraid that the Chinese, no matter how much they spend, can never do.
Yeah.
And you know something, Rick, I'm gonna completely agree with you that and then disagree with you and say, if you're saying should the USAGM/VOA budget be doubled next year? Absolutely. Absolutely.
No,
I've got a
the
lot of colleagues in the audience. I just want them to
Okay.
know that I said that the budget should be done. You know what? It is an amazing dollar for dollar, the impact. It's an amazing value, an amazing value. You wouldn't go wrong giving it more ability to do more of what it does. The number of people it reaches with the very small amount of resources it has. Yes, I would definitely say that.
Here's a question from the audience I want to make sure we get. Patricia Cabra writes, one of the themes of this new Biden administration has been to connect the value of foreign policy and what the State Department does to what benefits Americans at home as a whole. How do you think this can best be integrated into current structures in the Department of State and USAGM? How can those agencies make what they do benefit Americans in a way that Americans can feel and touch and understand?
Part of this has to be international education. And before we even get into the foreign policy value, you look at the revenue value to cities of foreign students coming in and what they contribute to the cities that have major foreign student populations. And this is even all the US government is doing is signing the visa form. These are not people who are being paid by the US government to be present, but that alone is a massive contribution. If you dollar for dollar, the international education in New York City is worth more than all the sports franchises in New York City put together. A much bigger business, foreign students coming into New York City. But just to talk about that would help. So people weren't thinking that international education was somehow freebies for foreigners. This is a tremendous part of tremendous benefit to the United States, material benefit to the United States. People want to come here for education.
Yeah.
Well, there's a two-word answer to that question that's going to immediately end our fantastic panel because it's so dull. Smith-Mundt. So,
yes.
So my fellow panelists are laughing. The Smith-Mundt Act, which is an anachronism, basically, it was from I don't remember, 1960 something, basically said that USAGM, although the term didn't exist then, can't have domestic audiences for its broadcasting. I mean, in the days of the internet and social media, I mean, it almost is ludicrous now. I do think that seeing the great journalism as I have over the years that all of the USAGM does, and VOA, RFERL, Office of Cuba Broadcasting, everybody, the fact that Americans can't see that, I think, is a disservice to America, and I would even argue is a disservice to the people who are funding USAGM.
Can I just say that the internet has sort of made a fool of the law, because now you can see. I mean, the Somalis of Minnesota are watching Somali language VOA now on the internet. And they've got a way to do it, and you really can't make a law against it because the internet is everywhere.
Right. I mean, so the law should be changed. Yeah.
Well, again, Rick, I also felt the same way. It's like, hey, wait a second, I'm doing all this great work, and my people are doing this great work, and they can't see it. But on the other hand, remember what is going to happen to the law if somebody other than you is taking advantage of it. A government-funded apparatus that can speak directly to the people of the United States is not necessarily something I think would have been a lot of fun to have in the last 4 years.
This has been a terrific conversation, gentleman and lady. Thank you very much. I think it's 6:29, and I think I'd better turn the microphone back to Janet at this time to end our session. And
I think I have the microphone, but no video yet, but I imagine it'll come up. Okay, start my video. What an amazing panel. We are so grateful. This was so much fun, and I was busy here nodding and taking notes, and we are so thankful and so grateful to all of you. I'm going to take advantage of the host privilege to end the program with one small plug for our institute. Nick Cull's suggestion to move USAGM out of Washington was a very interesting idea. But as the other panelists pointed out, USAGM and the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs at the State Department already have the support of many members of Congress. And so in order to recognize this, when I took over the directorship of GW's Institute for Public Diplomacy, it was my dream that we would one day establish a bipartisan award for congressional leadership in public diplomacy. And thanks to the wonderful generosity of the Walter Roberts Endowment, we have been able to do this. And we've now given out the Walter Roberts Award for Congressional Leadership in Public Diplomacy 4 times. The past awardees have included Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee, Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, Congresswoman Nita Lowey of New York, and most recently, Senator John Bozeman of Arkansas, who's been a tremendous supporter of the Fulbright program. And we did this because we wanted to highlight something, as you all have pointed out, that for many Americans is invisible. And it's been my experience that the majority of Americans, including those in my own family, have no idea what public diplomacy is, let alone how these programs have provided so many direct benefits to the American people. And it's been just delightful to listen to the 4 of you. You know, it's really been wonderful. Perhaps the highlight of my years as the director. So if you want to keep track of our award for congressional leadership in public diplomacy, which again is non-monetary, they just get a plaque. But what we do is give a small micro grant to an organization in the congressperson or senator's constituency that will then support public diplomacy. And so we're really proud of this. Anyway, you can follow all of that on our website. So thank you, David Ensor, Rick Stengel, Amanda Bennett, Nick Cull, and all of you in the audience, and of course to the Walter Roberts Endowment, which has made this program possible. And I want to point out that today's event could not have taken place without the hard work of IPDGC's program coordinator, Yvonne O, and our public diplomacy fellow, Amelia Puma. And we were also assisted by Helen Zheng and Tiffany Garcia, who is an undergraduate in Amelia Puma's Intro to Public Diplomacy class, who have been live tweeting the event like crazy. And go back and look at all that. And so thanks to all of you, but especially to Yvonne, Amelia, Helen, and Tiffany, and our panel. So stay healthy and safe, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you at future IPDGC events. Thank you.